On a narrow mountain pass, high above the burning ruins of Gondolin, an elf lord in golden armor faced a demon of shadow and flame. The creature towered twice his height, wielding a whip of fire and claws like iron. Glorfindel's blade gleamed in the hellish light. They fought on a precipice so narrow that one misstep meant death. The Balrog's whip cracked, severing stone and air. Glorfindel's sword struck true, cleaving through demon flesh. And then, in a final desperate grapple, the dirk found its mark. The Balrog shrieked, but as the demon fell backward into the abyss, it clutched Glorfindel's golden hair beneath his cap, and both, hero and monster, plummeted together into darkness. For most warriors, this would be the end of the story, but this would not be the end of Glorfindel's story, because in Tolkien's legendarium, some deaths are not final, and some heroes come back. Welcome to Ranger of the Realms. I'm your guide through the forgotten histories and hidden mysteries of Middle-earth. Today we're diving into one of the most extraordinary stories in all of Tolkien's legendarium. The tale of Glorfindel, a name some of you might recognize from The Lord of the Rings, where he rescues Frodo at the ford of Bruinen. But Glorfindel's story is far more remarkable than a single heroic rescue. Because that golden-haired elf lord who faced down the Nazgul in the Third Age had already died once before. Thousands of years earlier, fighting a Balrog in the First Age. And then he came back. This is a story that operates on three levels. First, it's an epic tale of heroic sacrifice, one of the most dramatic death scenes Tolkien ever wrote. Second, it's a deep theological mystery about what happens when elves die, and under what circumstances they might return. And third, it's a fascinating glimpse into Tolkien's own creative process, because the question of whether these two Glorfindels were the same person became one of the last problems Tolkien wrestled with before his death. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why Glorfindel is unique among all the elves of Middle-earth, why his death mattered so profoundly to the Valar that they sent him back, and why Tolkien himself spent his final creative energies reconciling this golden-haired warrior's impossible journey from death to resurrection, to a second life in a new age. So let's begin at the beginning. In the First Age of Middle-earth, in the year 510, at the fall of the last great refuge of the Noldor, this is the story of Glorfindel's death and resurrection, the elf who came back. To understand why Glorfindel's death mattered, we need to understand what he was protecting. And what he was protecting was nothing less than the last hope of the free peoples of Middle-earth. Gondolin, the hidden kingdom. Founded by Turgon of the Noldor in the First Age, this city stood for nearly 4 centuries as a beacon of light against Morgoth's darkness. Protected by the encircling mountains, hidden by ancient spells, Gondolin had never fallen. It was the most beautiful city ever built by elves in Middle-earth. White towers, golden domes, fountains and gardens that rivaled Valinor itself. But in the year 510 of the First Age, everything changed. Betrayed from within by Maeglin, who had been captured and tortured by Morgoth, Gondolin's location was revealed. And, on a day of festival, when the city least expected it, Morgoth's armies came. Dragons, Balrogs, endless legions of orcs. They poured through the secret passages, over the walls, into the very heart of the city. The 12 houses of Gondolin fought with desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed. House by house the defenses crumbled, the fountains ran red, the white towers burned. And in the chaos, a decision was made. Not everyone could be saved, but some must survive. The refugees, led by Tuor, husband of Eärendil, daughter of Turgon himself, would escape through a secret tunnel that led north through the mountains. Among them was Tuor and Eärendil's young son, a child named Eärendil. Remember that name, because the survival of this child would prove to be, as Tolkien would later write, of vital importance to the designs of the Valar. Among those who volunteered to guard the rear was Glorfindel, lord of the House of the Golden Flower. His house bore the emblem of a rayed sun on their shields. His name meant golden hair, and it was fitting, because his hair shone like spun gold, even in the darkness of that terrible night. Glorfindel had come late to the final battle in the city. His house had been pinned down in the great market, until they were relieved by the House of the Harp. But once the retreat began, Glorfindel took his position at the rear of the column, the most dangerous position, the position where heroes go to die. The refugees crossed the Vale of Tumladen, hidden by the smoke and mist rising from Gondolin's destruction. They climbed into the mountains, following the secret path that Eärendil had caused to be built years before, when she first suspected her cousin Maeglin's treachery. Higher and higher they climbed, exhausted, grieving, but still moving, until they reached Cirith Thorunath, the Eagle's Cleft. This was a narrow pass through the northern edge of the encircling mountains, a place of terrible beauty and terrible danger. On one side, sheer cliffs rose toward the sky. On the other, a yawning emptiness dropped away into shadow. The path itself was barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. They thought they had escaped. They thought Morgoth's armies were too busy sacking the city to pursue a handful of refugees. They thought they were safe. They were wrong. The ambush came without warning, orcs lying in wait even in this remote place, and with them, a Balrog, one of Morgoth's most terrible servants, a demon of shadow and flame, standing twice the height of the tallest elf, armed with whip and claws, its iron helm gleaming with malice. The refugees were trapped. Behind them, the narrow pass they had just traversed. Ahead, the Balrog and its orc servants. On either side, death by falling. There was nowhere to run. And so Glorfindel stepped forward. What happened next became legend, not just in our world as readers of Tolkien, but in Middle-earth itself. Glorfindel and the Balrog became a proverb among the Eldar, spoken whenever courage faced impossible odds. Tolkien's description of the battle is vivid and specific. Glorfindel's ardor, his fierce determination, drove the Balrog from point to point. His mail protected him from the creature's whip and claws. He beat heavily upon the Balrog's iron helm with his sword. The demon's whip cracked like thunder, shattering stone, but Glorfindel would not yield. And then, showing skill and courage that would echo through the ages, Glorfindel did something extraordinary. His blade found its mark. He hewed off the Balrog's whip arm at the elbow. The demon shrieked in pain and fear, and in its agony it sprang at Glorfindel. They grappled on that narrow pinnacle of rock, elf and demon, locked in a struggle where the slightest misstep meant oblivion. Glorfindel's left hand found a dirk at his belt. With strength born of desperation, he thrust upward, driving the blade into the Balrog's belly. The creature was double his stature, but the dirk found its mark. It pierced demon flesh. The Balrog shrieked and fell backward from the rock. But as it fell, in its death throes, the Balrog's claw caught Glorfindel's golden hair beneath his cap, and both fell together into the abyss. Silence, except for the wind howling through Cirith Thorunath, and the quiet weeping of the refugees, who had just witnessed their defender's death. But then, something miraculous happened. From the sky, a great shape descended. Thorondor, lord of the eagles, the mightiest of his kind, plunged into the abyss, and when he rose again, carried in his talons was the broken body of Glorfindel. The eagles had heard the battle, and they came. They swept down upon the orcs at Cirith Thorunath, slaying them or casting them from the heights. They drove away Morgoth's servants so completely that no word of the refugees' escape reached Morgoth for weeks. Thanks to the eagles, and to Glorfindel's sacrifice, Tuor, Idril, and young Eärendil escaped. The refugees buried Glorfindel in a cairn of stones beside the pass, and Tolkien tells us something beautiful and mysterious. A green turf came there, and yellow flowers bloomed upon it amid the barrenness of stone, until the world was changed. Yellow flowers, the color of Glorfindel's hair, growing in a place where nothing should grow. A sign, perhaps, that this death was different, that this sacrifice had been seen by powers greater than Morgoth. Many songs were sung of that duel. Glorfindel and the Balrog became a byword for impossible courage, for the willingness to stand alone against the darkness so that others might live. But for Glorfindel himself, the story had only just begun. When an elf dies in Middle-earth, something happens that is fundamentally different from the death of men. Men receive what Tolkien called the gift of Ilúvatar. Their spirits leave the world entirely, passing beyond the circles of Arda to a fate unknown even to the Valar. But elves are bound to the world. Their spirits, their Faer, remain within the circles of Arda, summoned to the halls of Mandos in the uttermost west. The halls of Mandos, also called the halls of waiting, a place in Valinor where the spirits of dead elves are summoned to dwell. It is overseen by Mandos, whose true name is Namo, the doomsman of the Valar, a place of judgment, of waiting, and sometimes of second chances. Glorfindel's Faer made that journey. His spirit, separated from his broken body on the rocks of Cirith Thorannath, travelled to the halls. And there, Tolkien tells us, he spent a short time waiting. But what makes Glorfindel's case unique is what happened next. Tolkien developed complex laws about elvish death and reincarnation, particularly in his later writings collected in Laws and Customs among the Eldar. Under normal circumstances, after a period of waiting, an elf's Faer could be reincarnated, but only through rebirth. The spirit would enter the world again as a newborn child, identical in form to their previous body when fully grown. It was a second chance at life, but it meant starting over, childhood, growing up again. No memory of the previous life until maturity. Some elves in Mandos refused rebirth. Miriel, first wife of Finwë, chose to remain in the halls forever rather than return. And some, Feanor chief among them, were judged to have done such evil in life that they were denied the possibility of return. But Glorfindel was different. In Tolkien's final essays about Glorfindel, written in 1972, the year before Tolkien's death, we learn the reasoning of the Valar. Glorfindel had left Valinor reluctantly as part of the Noldorin exile. He was blameless in the kinslaying at Alqualondë. He bore the exile's burden without deserving it. And most importantly, his sacrifice in defeating the Balrog was deemed to be, and I quote, of vital importance to the designs of the Valar. Why vital? Because among the refugees he saved was Eärendil. That child would grow to become Eärendil the Mariner, who would sail to Valinor and plead for the Valar's intervention against Morgoth. His plea would lead to the War of Wrath and Morgoth's defeat. Without Glorfindel's sacrifice, Eärendil might never have survived to fulfill his destiny. The entire history of Middle-earth turned on that moment at Cirith Thorannath. So the Valar made a decision that was virtually unprecedented. Glorfindel would not be reborn as a child. He would be re-embodied, remade in a new body as a fully grown elf. This was the work of Manwë himself, king of the Valar. But more than that, he would be enhanced. Tolkien writes that once restored and allowed to dwell in Valinor, Glorfindel's spiritual power was greatly enhanced, almost to the level of the Maiar. Think about that. The Maiar are essentially angels in Tolkien's mythology. Beings like Gandalf, Saruman, Sauron himself, and Glorfindel, already an elder of great stature, was elevated to near their level. His self-sacrifice had purified him. His time in the company of the Eldar and Maiar in Valinor, where he dwelt for an unknown period, enhanced him further. The Maiar themselves regarded him as an equal. He lived simultaneously in the seen and unseen worlds. He became a being of light as well as flesh. And then, in the Second Age, Manwë made another decision. Glorfindel would return to Middle-earth. The exact date is uncertain. Tolkien considered several options. SA 1200, when Sauron first tried to enter Lindon and was rejected by Gil-galad. SA 1590, around the forging of the Three Rings, or SA 1600, just after the One Ring was made and Eärendil was attacked. The last date seems most likely based on Tolkien's later notes. Glorfindel was sent back as a counter to Sauron's revelation of his true power. His mission was clear. He would serve as an emissary of the Valar, a living representative of their power and will. He would aid Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor, and Elrond in their struggle against Sauron. He would be a counselor, a warrior, a guardian. Unlike the Istari, the wizards who would arrive much later in the Third Age, Glorfindel was not diminished or restricted. The Istari came as old men, with their powers limited. Glorfindel came as an elf in the prime of his strength, with powers enhanced beyond even what he had possessed in his first life. This is what makes Glorfindel unique in all of Tolkien's legendarium. He is the only elf who died heroically, was resurrected through divine grace, enhanced to near-angelic power, and sent back to continue the fight against evil. He is, in a very real sense, Tolkien's exploration of what resurrection and return might mean in his mythology. And so Glorfindel walked Middle-earth again, not as a memory, not as a legend, as a living elf, with all his memories of both his first life and his time in Valinor, carrying within him the weight of 2 ages and the blessing of the Valar themselves. For thousands of years after his return, Glorfindel served as an advisor and guardian in Middle-earth. He fought in battles whose names are now lost to history. He counseled kings and captains. He dwelt primarily in Rivendell, in the house of Elrond, who, as the son of Eärendil, had an indirect connection to Glorfindel's great sacrifice. But we catch glimpses of him at crucial moments. In the year 1975 of the Third Age, Glorfindel led a company of elves from Rivendell to the Battle of Fornost. This battle was instrumental in the defeat of Angmar, the Witch Realm in the north. When the armies of Gondor and the remnants of Arnor combined with elvish forces, they shattered Angmar's power. And as the Witch King, the Lord of the Nazgul himself, fled from the battlefield, Glorfindel pursued. But then he stopped, and he spoke a prophecy that would echo through the ages. Do not pursue him. He will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall. How did Glorfindel know this? Had his time in Mandos granted him prophetic sight? Or was this divine inspiration in the moment? Tolkien doesn't tell us, but that prophecy proved true. The Witch King would not fall until the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, thousands of years later, and it would be Éowyn, a woman, and Merry, a hobbit, who would strike him down, not the hand of man, indeed. But it's in the War of the Ring itself that we see Glorfindel most clearly, and it's here that his unique nature becomes most apparent. In October of 3018, Elrond sent Glorfindel out from Rivendell to search for Frodo and his companions. The Nazgul were abroad, hunting for the ring. Elrond needed someone who could face them, someone who would not fear them. Glorfindel met 5 of the 9 Nazgul on his search, and they fled from his presence. Think about that. These are the Ringwraiths, ancient kings of men, corrupted by Sauron's power, neither living nor dead, capable of spreading terror with their mere presence. They had just stabbed Frodo with a Morgul blade. They were at the height of their power, desperate to recover the ring. And they fled from a single elf. Why? Because Glorfindel existed in both the seen and unseen worlds simultaneously. The Nazgul dwell primarily in the Wraith world, the unseen realm. To them, most living beings appear as dim shadows, but Glorfindel shone like the sun. He was a being of light and power in both worlds. They could not touch him. They could not overcome him, so they fled. Glorfindel found Frodo and his companions in the Trollshores. Frodo was wounded, fading, being drawn into the Wraith world by the Morgul blade in his shoulder. Glorfindel touched the wound, and it began to heal. Just his touch had power against the weapons of the enemy. He gave Frodo his horse, Asfaloth, a white horse of great speed and intelligence, and when the Nazgul attacked at the ford of Bruinen, Glorfindel revealed himself in all his power. Tolkien tells us, Glorfindel revealed himself to be a lord among elves, and from him shone a great white light. Frodo, caught between the seen and unseen worlds because of the ring and his wound, saw both aspects of Glorfindel simultaneously. To ordinary sight, a golden-haired elf on the riverbank, but in the Wraith world, a figure of blazing radiance, a power that drove the Nazgul, whether willingly or not, into the river Bruinen, where Elrond's floods swept them away.
Days later, at the Council of Elrond, Glorfindel participated in the debate about what to do with the ring. His counsel was clear and logical. There were only two options: send the ring over the sea to Valinor, or destroy it in Mount Doom. He suggested the sea, but Gandalf pointed out the danger. Creatures in the deeps might find it and return it to Sauron. And there's a crucial moment in that council that reveals both Glorfindel's power and its limitations. Gandalf explains to Elrond why Glorfindel should not be part of the Fellowship. In this matter, it would be well to trust rather to their friendship than to great wisdom. Even if you chose for us an elf lord such as Glorfindel, he could not storm the Dark Tower, nor open the road to the fire by the power that is in him. Power alone would not win this war. The quest required humility, secrecy, friendship, the very qualities that hobbits embodied, not the might of one who had been to Valinor and back. So Glorfindel remained in Rivendell, a guardian, a counselor, a living reminder that the Valar had not abandoned Middle-earth, that even in the darkest times there were powers of light that had not diminished. Now we come to the final layer of this story, and in some ways the most fascinating, the question of whether Glorfindel of Gondolin and Glorfindel of Rivendell were the same person. This wasn't just a question for readers and scholars. It was a question that Tolkien himself wrestled with for years. And the answer is, Tolkien didn't originally intend them to be the same person at all. Christopher Tolkien, in his editorial notes to the Peoples of Middle-earth, is explicit about this. When J.R.R. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings in the 1930s and 40s, he simply reused a name he liked from his earlier writings. Glorfindel, golden hair. It was a beautiful name, and he'd created a heroic character with that name in 1917 for the Fall of Gondolin. So when he needed an elf to rescue Frodo at the ford, he pulled that name out again. It was name recycling, nothing more. No grand plan for resurrection and return. Just a writer reusing a good name in a vast mythology that had been developing for decades. But then, Tolkien noticed the duplication, and it bothered him. By the 1950s and 60s, Tolkien had become increasingly concerned with the internal consistency of his legendarium. He believed that in a fully realized secondary world, every elf's name should be unique. Names had power. Names had meaning. The same name shouldn't appear for two different people, especially two different elves, who had long memories and detailed genealogies. So Tolkien faced a choice. He could change one of the names, or he could make them the same person. Changing the name would have been easier, but making them the same person, that opened up extraordinary possibilities. It would require explaining how an elf who died in the First Age could appear alive and well in the Third Age. It would require exploring elvish resurrection, a concept that deeply troubled Tolkien's Catholic faith, since reincarnation is explicitly rejected by Christian doctrine. But Tolkien was nothing if not meticulous, and so, in 1972, the year before his death, he wrote 2 essays exploring this very question. These were some of his final creative works, some of his last words about Middle-earth. The essays are titled Glorfindel I and Glorfindel II in the Peoples of Middle-earth. In them, Tolkien works through the implications of making them the same person. He establishes that Glorfindel died heroically, that his sacrifice saved Eärendil, that this made him worthy of resurrection, that he was re-embodied and sent back to Middle-earth, that he returned with enhanced powers. He even addresses the linguistic evidence. The name, Glorfindel, uses an archaic form of Sindarin. The element findel, meaning lock of hair, would have evolved into Finnel by the Third Age. If Glorfindel had been named in the Third Age, he would have been called Glorfindel, but his name retained the ancient form, because he was ancient. He'd been named in the First Age, and the name hadn't changed. Linguistic proof that he was the same person across the ages. Christopher Tolkien confirmed that his father had resolved the question definitively. They were the same person. Glorfindel of Gondolin and Glorfindel of Rivendell were one and the same.
The hero who fell into the abyss with the Balrog had returned from death itself. Now you might ask, should we consider these essays canonical? They were never published by Tolkien himself. They were found among his papers after his death. Does that make them less authoritative? Scholars have debated this, but the consensus is that these essays represent Tolkien's final intention for the character. He was actively working on this problem at the end of his life. He reached a conclusion, and Christopher Tolkien, who knew his father's work more intimately than anyone, confirmed that conclusion when he published the essays. This matters for more than just academic reasons, because Glorfindel's story represents Tolkien's deepest exploration of elvish death and resurrection. It's his most detailed working through of how death might not be final for certain beings in his mythology. It reveals his struggle to reconcile Catholic theology, which he believed absolutely, with the demands of his subcreated world. Tolkien defended elvish reincarnation as valid within subcreation. Elves weren't humans. They were a different kind of rational incarnate creature, bound to the world in a way humans weren't. Their deaths and potential returns operated by different rules he, as sub-creator, had the right to establish. But he still struggled with it. In a 1954 letter, he admitted it was cheating to bring Gandalf back from the dead. He was deeply aware of the theological implications. He didn't take resurrection lightly. And yet he chose to make Glorfindel's resurrection part of the legendarium. He spent his final creative energies reconciling the two characters. He wrote thousands of words exploring the metaphysics of how it happened and why. That tells us something profound. Glorfindel mattered to Tolkien, not just as a convenient name or a heroic character, but as a test case for exploring the boundaries between death and life, between sacrifice and grace, between his Catholic faith and his mythological imagination. And so we come to the end of Glorfindel's story. Or rather, to the end of what we know of his story. Because Tolkien never tells us what happened to Glorfindel after the War of the Ring. Did he sail west with the other elves, returning to Valinor where he had already dwelt once before? Or did he remain in Middle-earth, his mission ongoing, a guardian of the mortal lands? We don't know. Perhaps it doesn't matter, because Glorfindel's significance isn't in his ending, it's in his journey. 3 journeys, really. The journey from life to death, falling into the abyss with the Balrog, sacrificing everything to save others. The journey from death to resurrection, dwelling in Mandos, being re-embodied by the Valar's grace, enhanced beyond his original nature. And the journey from return to reconciliation, walking Middle-earth again, serving his purpose, becoming a bridge between ages and between the divine and mortal realms. But there's also a 4th journey, Tolkien's own journey with this character. From the heroic death scene written in 1917, to the name reused in the 1940s, to the problem noticed in the 1950s and 60s, to the final resolution in 1972. 55 years of creative development. A lifetime of thinking about death, sacrifice, grace, and return. Glorfindel represents something essential in Tolkien's vision of Middle-earth. The idea that death is not always final. That heroic sacrifice can transcend mortal limitations. That grace, divine favor, can restore what was lost, and even enhance it beyond its original form. These are deeply Christian themes, even within a mythology that sometimes seem to conflict with Christian doctrine. Sacrificial love, death leading to greater life, the purification of suffering, grace freely given to those deemed worthy, a mission and purpose in returning to the world. Glorfindel also represents the power of story itself, both within Middle-earth and in our world. Within Middle-earth, Glorfindel and the Balrog became a legend, a proverb, a story that gave courage to others. In our world, Glorfindel's story shows us Tolkien's creative process, his willingness to wrestle with difficult questions, his commitment to making his sub-created world as real and consistent as possible. And perhaps most movingly, Glorfindel represents hope. The hope that death is not the end, that sacrifice is seen and remembered, that heroes can rise again, that even when all seems lost, on a narrow mountain pass with a Balrog barring the way, there is still the possibility of victory, of survival, of continuation. The refugees Glorfindel saved went on to change the world. Eärendil sailed to Valinor. Elrond founded Rivendell. The line of heroes continued unbroken. And Glorfindel himself returned to continue serving in a new age, carrying the memory of his first life and the blessing of the Valar into new battles against darkness. Some deaths are not final. Some heroes come back. And some stories, like Glorfindel's, echo across ages, reminding us that courage, sacrifice, and grace can transcend even death itself. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Glorfindel's extraordinary tale. If these hidden corners of Tolkien's world fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, please consider subscribing to Ranger of the Realms. Each episode, we uncover another mystery, another untold story from the legendarium. We explore the depths that Tolkien created, the histories, the languages, the theology, the characters who deserve to be remembered. Until next time, may your path lead you to forgotten truths,